I'm in the countryside surrounding Faversham in Kent, England. And in the 1990s, Marlon Brando, one of Hollywood's most iconic actors, lived here and he bloody loved it. That's really weird, so I'm going to find out why.
Hey, Stella!
To really understand just why this place in particular mattered so much to Brando, you really have to explain, and especially for generations who are less familiar with him, just how famous he was. Born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1924, Marlon Brando arrived in New York as a teenager and studied acting under Stella Adler. And his breakthrough, as many of us are well aware of, came from playing Stanley Kowalski in Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire. When that play was adapted from Broadway for cinema in 1951, it was Brando who reprised his role. And after this breakout role, it's fair to say that Hollywood acting was never quite the same again. You can almost fast forward today and look at the success of Christopher Nolan and other filmmakers who have gone for a lot more of that kind of intense, grounded reality in their filmmaking and the acting in their films. Brando had that kind of very subtle, almost in some cases, mumbly way of acting. And that hadn't really existed in the same way before. You were coming out of movies that were, big acting, stage acting on screen, that kind of thing. And so these quiet, subtle, nuanced performances really elevated him above the crowd. Then came On the Waterfront, and Brando's performance as Terry Malloy won him the Academy Award for Best Actor. So by his early 30s, he wasn't merely a run-of-the-mill film star, he was arguably already the best actor of his generation. All of that is, I think, really worth remembering when we come to talking about Marlon Brando just wandering around places like this. We're not talking about an actor here who'd had his 15 minutes of fame, we're talking about an icon, ultimately, as much as he was very complex and accused of some ultimately very bad things. It's hard to argue the effect this man had on cinema and acting in general. You just can't argue with that. Now, his career steadily, as is well documented, became famously quite erratic during the 1960s, before a grand return in The Godfather returned him to the very top of Hollywood in 1972. And for this performance, he won himself another Academy Award. Although he famously rejected this Oscar for The Godfather to allow Sachin Littlefeather to take his place in order to protest Hollywood's portrayal of Native Americans. But by this point, Brando's relationship with fame was definitely complicated. There had been many dramas, professional and personal, along the way, and he'd long been intensely protective of his privacy, whilst becoming increasingly cynical about the film industry he was working in. And many, many years later, hundreds of hours of his private recordings revealed a man who spent considerable time self-analysing, looking at his own childhood, his fame, and the strange, bubble, weird life of celebrity that had been created around him. The public saw the famous face of Marlon Brando, but he himself seemed increasingly interested in finding out who he was underneath it. And the one thing we can say is the man underneath that was incredibly complicated. Which brings us to the beginning of the 1990s, when Brando suddenly had a lot more on his plate than just Hollywood. On the night of the 16th of May 1990, something absolutely terrible happened inside his Los Angeles home. Brando's daughter, Cheyenne, was pregnant by a young Tahitian man named Dag Drolet. That evening, Brando's eldest son, Christian, confronted Drolet. Christian had been told that Drolet had mistreated Cheyenne, and during that confrontation, Christian shot him. Dag Drolet died inside Brando's house. Now, afterwards, Christian maintained that he'd only intended to frighten Drolet and that the gun had discharged accidentally. But prosecutors disputed that account, and eventually Christian pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. All of a sudden, Brando's private family life, and specifically this catastrophic event, was being played out in front of the world's press, and Brando himself, of course, even had to appear in court. At Christian's sentencing in 1991, he didn't really hold back, and he spoke about his own failures as a parent, again demonstrating a man who appeared deeply self-reflective in his older years. Christian received a 10-year prison sentence, but the consequences of that awful night were far from over. I think it's really important that we know all of this context around this period in his life, because it really helps us understand why somewhere like this, somewhere as quiet and unassuming as Selling, became so attractive to him. He'd spent decades dealing with fame, controversy, obviously some of that of his own making, and he was now going through, one of the most intensely traumatic things a family could possibly go through, and it's all in the public eye. It's public entertainment, it's out there for everybody to see, and whatever you think about somebody, that's a lot to deal with. And it was about to get worse. Cheyenne Brando's life had already been badly affected by a serious car accident back in 1989, but after Drolet's death, her condition deteriorated further. There were multiple hospitalizations and suicide attempts, while the legal proceedings around Drolet's killing continued in the background. And then, on the 16th of April 1995, Cheyenne died by suicide at her mother's home in Tahiti. She was only 25 years old, and all of a sudden a family who had been enduring a lot of public scrutiny for 5 years had the spotlight right back on them again. And it is around this point that the story finally moves here to Kent. Around 1996, Brando came to Britain, and according to one woman who was best placed to know him, all he wanted to do was find somewhere quiet. Her name is Belinda Friou, or Frixu. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that pronunciation, I most likely am. And she recalled that what Brando wanted most of all was quiet countryside, just anywhere away from people constantly barraging him with questions about his private life. And she just happened to know somewhere perfect.
He'd come to London around 1996. I think he was making a movie at the time. He wanted to go to the countryside. It was difficult for him to go anywhere because at the time he was having personal family problems and people would keep asking him about it. I had and still have a flat on Lees Court Estate, just outside Faversham, so I said I'd take him there. I told him how quiet it was, how nobody would bother him and he could just sit in the garden and be at peace. So he came down with a couple of his children and he absolutely fell in love with the area. He treasured its natural beauty and peacefulness.
Belinda was something of a legal counsel to Brando and had been working with him for a long time on movie deals, but also dealing with personal things and, the tangled web that his personal life had become. And she even said that Brando became an actual real godfather to her son. Thanks to this being a particularly private getaway, all the information we have comes from, more recent recollections from that period. We obviously don't really have much at all from Brando himself during this period. It's just little snippets that we've gotten from people who were very, very close to him at the time. And according to Friou, he absolutely fell in love with it here. The peace, the countryside, and more importantly, the almost complete anonymity that he found here. And it's 2026. This was the 90s. It's unbelievably quiet now. And considering it's the height of the summer holidays right now, we're in another heat wave, the 5th heat wave, I think, of the year so far. And it's dead quiet. There's a few people tree felling. There's a couple of tractors over there in that field. But apart from that, not a single car has passed me by since I started filming this. So you can imagine how much more quiet it must have been in 1996. Perfect for what Brando was looking for. If there's one thing you can say about Selling and the surrounding countryside, it's not LA.
He came down on a Friday to stay for the weekend and stayed for 6 months. He loved it so much.
Now, as the story is told now, it's Marlon Brando fell in love with Faversham. That's true to an extent. He fell in love with the area around Faversham. But really and specifically, it was the villages of Selling and Sheldwich, these small English villages that were closest to the Lees Court estate. It's around here that he spent his time wandering, exploring and relaxing. He'd occasionally obviously pop into Faversham to get his hair cut, other minor little things, but this is where he spent his time. His longtime assistant and kind of personal lawyer, Caroline Barrett, would remember her time with him here very fondly. And specifically, Owens Court Road, which happens to be exactly where I am right now. So we are now 100% walking in the footsteps of Marlon Brando.
Now, we came to Selling intending to stay for a weekend, but Mr. Brando loved it so much we stayed for nearly 6 months. He fell in love with your beautiful countryside, and in particular, Owens Court and the little lane serving it. We walked regularly down this lane, enjoying the landscapes and admiring your stunning beamed Tudor houses and farm buildings.
This right here was one of Brando's favourite spots. I can kind of see why, really. I mean, the road itself is really quiet, but there are some beautiful, big, potentially Tudor-era buildings down here. If you want somewhere that screams quiet, sedate English countryside, you're in it. There is something incredibly simple about it. There's a man who'd spent almost his entire adult life being photographed, questioned, interrupted, accosted constantly, almost every waking hour of the day. And it turns out all he really needed was a few acres of English countryside. It does make you realise how lucky I am, we are, people who live in the UK, to have such easy access to areas like this. And I'll be honest, as I love them, they're beautiful, and I really appreciate how stunning the English countryside is in a lot of places across the country. But you do take it for granted at some points. And for somebody who was coming from that kind of environment, from that world, who maybe hadn't really ever kind of let himself dive headfirst into, well, the middle of nowhere, you can really understand why this was the perfect place for somebody looking to get away. The idea of just being able to leave his flat and just walk for miles, for hours, and not be interrupted by a single person must have just been completely alien and at the same time incredibly refreshing. Not to get too poetic, but the English countryside can really be a remedy to a lot of ills. Walking down here though, I can't quite escape the thought of turning a corner and just bumping into Don Corleone.
Various recollections collected about Brando's time here, although few, do paint an intriguing picture. He wasn't hiding inside this enormous country estate, but he appears to have genuinely enjoyed exploring the area, walking the lanes, looking at the old buildings, just enjoying the countryside. And perhaps, obviously most importantly, being generally left alone.
I think that's the part of this story that stands out the most for me, is that he did, for a very significant period of time, have a long break here, with none of the usual interruptions, with none of the usual badgering from the press, until, as we'll find out, it all went wrong. But it's the fact that the locals here definitely knew that Marlon Brando was staying nearby. They definitely saw him walking around, and they didn't bother him. They had almost what sounds like kind of an unspoken understanding, an unspoken respect between them. Just going to interrupt this for a second, just to say I've just spotted something that I've never seen before, and I was talking about this being Britain's 5th heatwave this year at the beginning of the video. I've just spotted out in the field what I can only describe as a small dust tornado, what I think in some parts of the world is called a dust devil, working its way across this field behind me. Maybe I should be taking everything I've said back so far. Maybe if Brando was here today, he would feel slightly more at home. So, why here? Well, I think it's plainly obvious that Marlon Brando could have ended up in any small English village, in any small section of countryside across the country, and he would have probably had the same experience. It was just fate, luck of the draw, pure happenstance that this is where he happened to end up. But I think that's telling. I think that tells us that there is something universal to the small English village. As very different as they all are, and I'm sure all the locals will claim they are very unique, they all also have that same universal, consistent peace and quiet. That feeling of somewhere that hasn't really changed or been disturbed for decades, centuries even. You have the small local shops, the pub, the church, and that's about it. A few farms dotted around here and there, but I think you can say that for pretty much every small English village. So I think he could have been happy in plenty of places. It just happened to be Faversham and Selling.
Brando's relationship with fame had always been uneasy. His career had taken him from Broadway to Hollywood, from international sex symbol to two-time Oscar winner. But fame also meant that some of the most painful events of his life were consumed in the public. The killing of Drolet, Christian's prosecution, Cheyenne's illness, and finally, her death. We shouldn't claim that Brando came to Kent specifically because of any single one of those events, but Belinda Frieux's recollection gives us something a little more concrete. When Brando came to Britain around 1996, he did want to escape some of these problems, and she offered him somewhere peaceful where she knew the people wouldn't bother him.
But unfortunately, all good things must come to an end.
He was planning to stay for a whole year, but one day we'd gone into Faversham, where he was sat at a coffee shop when someone recognised him. And while he was having something to eat and drink, the press arrived. They then followed us to Leeds Court, and that was it. For him, it spoilt it.
So, after he left Kent and the UK, Brando continued working. The Island of Dr. Moreau came out in 1996. There was The Brave in 1997, and his final completed film, in which he starred with Robert De Niro, was The Score in 2001. But his health was deteriorating, and despite returning to visit a few times here and there, ultimately he became quite reclusive in his last years, and the visits to Kent became more and more infrequent and eventually stopped altogether. But again, from our reliable witnesses, it seems like his affection for this place never disappeared.
2 weeks before he died, he called me and he said, "All I dream about is coming back to Kent. I think if he hadn't died, he'd have made the journey again."
Marlon Brando died on the 1st of July 2004. He was 80 years old. It really is a fascinatingly unusual end to the life of a man who'd done and seen so much bad and good in his career and his life. But it's such a weird chapter to finish on. He lived in Hollywood, he'd travelled the world, he owned an island in the South Pacific. But amongst all of that, all of those what must have been incredible memories, in his final days, one of the main things on his mind was this very small, very normal section of Kent. Ultimately, I think it's quite clear to see why this ended up being such a special place for Marlon Brando. I think in a life that was full of trauma and complexities, as we've said, some self-inflicted, this was simplicity. This was calm, peace, a quiet English village life, which, ignoring the massive lorry driving behind me, is something that appeals to so many. For those of us that live here and live this small country life, we shouldn't take for granted, because it clearly holds a real magic for those who are completely inexperienced with it. And I, for one, absolutely adore the English countryside. And if I could, would spend every single waking hour just wandering country lanes and public footpaths. In fact, that's kind of what I'm trying to do with this channel. I don't know if you've noticed. Well, on that note, as we come to the end of Owens Court Road, thank you for watching. This was a little bit different, a bit of a palate cleanser, if I'm honest, because, you know, some of the topics we cover on here can get a little bit heavy, so it's nice to cover something that really kind of, I don't know, shows off one of the things I love most about this country. So if you enjoyed today's video, if you found it interesting, make sure to give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment if you've got suggestions of other interesting kind of small historical stories like this that you'd like me to cover. I'm always fascinated to hear what some people bring up, because obviously Googling stuff doesn't always bring up some of these more niche, interesting stories that are maybe kind of more locked within local communities. So share away in the comments. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.